sharing their wealth of knowledge and expertise with the entire NASA workforce. It's really been enjoyable. It's also been very educational, and we've received lots of compliments and kudos about the speakers and the content of their presentations. So I can't express enough how much we appreciate JSC letting your folks talk to the entire workforce. Today's speaker is Larry Weir. He'll be discussing exercise and heat stress, and it's a timely topic since I think the entire United States is probably enjoying temperatures of 90 and above. This session is going to be recorded. A copy of Larry's slides is now available on the Occupational Health website, ohp.nasa.gov. The slides from the entire series will be posted on the ohp.nasa.gov website until the end of this calendar year. For those who are attending by phone, please ensure that your phone is on mute during the presentation unless you have a question for Larry. And if you need to step away from the meeting while you're on the phone, please don't put your phone on hold and hit that hold button. Just please disconnect and then reconnect when you're able to. And with that, Larry, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. I want to say that I really do appreciate the opportunity to give these talks. We've really enjoyed giving them. We think these topics are very important. Some folks have asked me, why did you decide to talk about heat stress at the end of the summer? Many people think the summer's all over once Monday Night Football starts, and it has started, by the way. But the hottest month of the year, especially here, is now, and you said it's around 90. 90 is a cool trend for down here, so it's way over that. I've got a picture here of my granddad. That was taken in 1930. The picture was taken in 1930. 3 years later, he was dead. He died of a heat stroke. So heat stroke is a very personal thing for our family. And the little girl there in the front bottom left, blonde-headed little girl, is my mother. She was about 7 years old when this was taken, so her dad died when she was 10. It was in the middle of the Depression, so they just lost their farm, which was fairly common in the Depression. He'd gone up to East Texas to work on the gas pipeline. And all across America, we were laying gas lines all across America, and he was working on one of those big projects. And he died of heat stroke, and left his family, seriously destitute. About 24 years later, when I was about 10, 11 years old, his best friend came to our house for a visit. He was present at the time that my grandfather died. And he told us the story of what happened. He said that on this day, happened to be a Monday, it was very, very hot and humid up in East Texas. And in the afternoon, Lloyd, my granddad, who was a great, big, hard-working guy, he's almost 6'5", weighed just under 190 pounds, began to act in a very uncharacteristic fashion. He couldn't follow instructions. He couldn't concentrate. He was acting very confused. He was very red in the face, sweating profusely, and asking for water. Now, this is 1933. They didn't have igloos of ice chests sitting all up and down the gas line. The closest water was about a quarter of a mile away, and they rationed water. And the line boss came up and then asked what was the matter with him. He must have been hungover from the weekend celebration because it was a Monday. And his friend said, well, that would work for anybody else, but Lloyd doesn't drink. That can't be the problem. After a little bit, he began to throw up. He lost consciousness. And this guy telling the story said they picked him up and tried to move him. And he said when he picked him up, he felt like he's picking up a piece of hot metal. His body was so hot. And then they tried to move him, and when they tried to put him in the shade, but all of the terrain there around was scraped bare. To lay these pipelines, they'd scrape it bare. Remember, these pipes were about 5 feet, 4.5 feet roughly in diameter, so they were huge. And so they had to scrape all the terrain around there bare. There was no trees or anything available for over 100 meters. And they found a little bush that was like a little thorn bush and put him under it. And his friend didn't want to lose his job, and the line boss was telling everybody to get back to work, and so he did. They got back to work, and he came back to visit Lloyd about 3 hours later, and he was dead. So that's a pretty serious and very true story. Now let's reel forward to today. This is a graphic that I got from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that shows differences in ambient or average annual temperature yearly temperature as compared to the average temperature between the year 1900 and 2000. So the century average temperature for the 20th century is that flat mark, is that baseline. So if it's a blue column, it means it was below the average for the century. If it was a red column, it was above the average. You may notice that the 1930s had a lot of red marks. So the 1930s, when my granddad died, was a very hot decade. In fact, the hottest average temperature for the year up until recently was 1936. That record was broken last year, 2011. Notice how red it is now from 2000 to 2010. Starting with the 1970s, we haven't had very many blue years. It's all been red. It's all been hotter than it had been in the previous decades. And the United States has grown and has seen its temperatures increase about the same as the rest of the world. There's some difference in that since the late 70s, our country has increased its temperature at a greater rate than the rest of the world, but generally the whole world has been heating up. So there's no question, I don't know what your political beliefs are about global warming. That's not the point. No doubt about it as far as recorded climatology goes. It's hotter now than it used to be. In the last decade, the last year 2000 to 2009 was the hottest decade on record. So it is definitely hotter now. And we've had record heat-related deaths. In the last 2 years, we've had more heat stroke deaths in the United States, twice as many heat stroke deaths in the United States from all causes. I mean, anything across the United States, mostly in the summertime, twice as much than in 10 years previous, in the average 10 years previous. So it's beginning to show. What this little slide shows on the left side of the screen, the little red graphic there, shows data taken from high school sports, deaths and injuries associated with heat. 3 times as high since the year 2000, 2 to 3 times as high as the 15 years previous to that. So we're having far more heat casualties now than we used to have. Now, it's an absolute crime to kill a high school kid. I mean, it just should not happen. It certainly shouldn't happen as a result of heat. But most of the deaths that are occurring in heat-related deaths or in high school kids are happening in practice. Not in the games, but in practice, and most of those practices are being done right now in August. Many folks say, why are you worried about the heat? Because the summer is almost over. Well, most of the heat deaths are happening now, right before the football season starts, around 2/3 of them. That center graphic was taken from a study done by the Centers for Disease Control. They did a random sample of 100 high schools across the United States, just got information on heat illnesses, not just deaths, but illnesses. And you notice most of the illnesses occurred in August. And the rate of illness was 10 times greater in football than in any other sport. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have heat illness in wrestling and in cross-country track and in other sports. We do. It's just very, very dangerous in football. And lately, we've had more of them. Last year, for example, in August, we had 5 high school kids die in preseason practice. 5 of them died in 1 month. So that's much higher than ever happened before. And the difference now as compared to the past is that it's hotter now than it was in the past, and the players are bigger than they ever were before. The kid in that picture is about 285 pounds. Now I told you my grandfather was a big guy. He was almost 6'5", 190 pounds. He couldn't make the team. I mean, this kid weighs 100 pounds more than my granddad did. We never heard of anybody weighing that much when I was playing sports in high school. Now they're a lot bigger. Plus, they're coming off the couch in the summertime in the air conditioning, and they're going out to play football. Even if they practice, the coach gets them to the gym to work out, they're practicing in air conditioning. And so the first real exposure to the heat is when they go to practice. So that was an introduction. So this is what I'm going to talk about today, and that's about heat stress and how serious it can be. It's not just a minor thing. And I'm explaining, how our bodies gain heat and how we can lose heat. Some of the physiologic adjustments, mostly in the circulatory system or the blood system. The value of rehydration after dehydration, how we can acclimatize for the heat, some of the heat injuries that you can expect, some tips for exercising in the heat despite the fact that it's hot, and some other environmental factors. Now, how do we acquire heat? There are many ways that our bodies gain heat, and I've given a list there on the left side of the picture. But the most important ones I put in bold. That's from muscular activity and from the environment. Now, if you just go outside and stand out in the heat, just go outside today and stand out there, and right now it's about 95, you're going to get hot just standing there. If you were to go outside and if it was 30 degrees, freezing, and you started to be very, very active, you'd also get hot because your muscles metabolize heat. We just got through watching the Olympics, and those are the most efficient athletes in the world. No doubt about it. Even the most efficient, best-trained athletes in the world are only about 40% efficient, meaning that of all the energy that their bodies produce, only about 40% is converted into running or throwing or jumping or doing whatever the activity is. Most of that, 60% or more, is heat. Now, most of us mortals, us human people, non-Olympic athletes, are only around 15% efficient. That means around 80% or more of our energy is heat, and that heat has to be dissipated. And if it isn't dissipated, it will kill us. Now, the way we lose heat is kind of the reverse to the way we gain heat. And we lose it through radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. And I put the two most important ones in bold, radiation and evaporation. That accounts for the greatest cause for us to get to cool ourselves off. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Our body is equipped with a little thermostat. It's called the hypothalamus, which is a sort of a gland that's located right at the base and center of your brain. And that little thermostat, like the thermostat in your home, is very sensitive to changes in temperature. But different from the thermostat in our home, when it assumes the unacceptable temperature, it either makes the air conditioner make your room cooler, or makes your heater make the room warmer, depending on however you've set it. But the hypothalamus can't do that. What it can do is it can send electrical signals to organs to enable the body to gain, to acquire, or to lose heat. The principal source of information for cold comes from nerves located in the skin. Come on in. We got another guest here. From nerves located in the skin. And so those nerves recognize that it's cold. And so it sends that information to the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus wants to keep the body temperature regulated at about 98.6. plus or minus 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree centigrade. So it can go up to about 100 or so, or it can go down to 97 or thereabouts before it has to make any serious adjustment. But it doesn't like it very much outside those two values. The principal source of information for heat comes from the blood. And the blood, down in the deep blood. And so now the vessels connected to the hypothalamus perfuse that gland in blood. And so now if the blood temperature goes up, it tells you that the body is too hot and it's going to have to make changes to cool off. So now it's going to give these signals either to start shivering if it's too cold, and since this is a heat class, I won't talk much about cold. So it's going to tell you to do one of two things. Either it's going to help you to lose heat by irradiation or by evaporative cooling from sweating. So it's going to cause the blood vessels near the center of the muscles to constrict, to reduce heat flow to the muscle, so that the blood located near the shell of the body, the skin, to dilate, open up, so you get more blood near the surface of the skin, so that helps to irradiate that surface temperature outward to the environment. And it also sends a signal to the sweat glands to produce sweat. So here's a guy, he's out running on a hot day. He's running, this is a picture of a guy running a marathon, and the temperature outside is close to 90. So he's running a hot day in a marathon, and he's acquiring heat from the solar radiation from the sun. And by the way, that radiation comes and hits him straight in the face or on top of the head. It also can bounce off the pavement. So it's reflective radiation. And radiation doesn't require any touching. It's just a kind of electromagnetic rays that go into the body where we can acquire some heat from that in that way. It also heats up the surface that he's running on. He's running on a street. So that asphalt or that concrete is also heated up, and that radiates heat out to his body. So he's acquiring all this heat. And if you ever walk outside and stand on the sidewalk in bare feet, you can tell the sidewalk acquires heat. So he's acquiring heat by conduction up through his shoes. So he's getting heat that way. He can lose some heat by convection. That is, the wind can blow the heat away from him. That's how we get wind chill. But his body is also getting hotter and hotter from muscle metabolism. Even very, very efficient athletes can get a body temperature of 104 degrees, and it doesn't tend to bother them because they've acclimatized and managed to train. But that's the heat that the body metabolizes through energy metabolism. So now he's trying to get rid of that heat. First thing he does, he tries to radiate the heat outward by causing the blood vessels near the surface of the skin to dilate. That sends the blood near the surface of the skin, so he's going to turn kind of red in the face. And that blood, if it's warmer than the outdoor temperature, it will help to transfer that heat from his body to the environment. That works very well as long as the environmental temperature is 92 degrees Fahrenheit or less. When it's 92 or more, he can't warm up because that's equal to skin temperature. I mean, he can't cool off because that's equal to skin temperature. You talk about a typical day in South Texas and in Florida and other places between May and September. And so that doesn't work very well when the outdoor temperature is that hot. The other way is evaporative cooling. He gets some evaporative cooling just by breathing that moisture out of his mouth, and you can see that on a cold day when the fog comes out of your mouth. So that's minor, but that's some. The principal way is for him to produce sweat, and the sweat has to evaporate. Now, that's very, very effective. Evaporative cooling is very effective unless he's also exercising in a very humid area. We're talking about Texas and Florida and lots of places. Now the air is full of moisture and it doesn't want any more of your moisture. It's got plenty of it, and so it's very difficult for you to cool off that way. So what's going to happen to him is his body tends to overheat. Before he goes out to exercise, he's got to be very careful about the clothing that he wears. If you ever watch tennis matches, baseball games, and so forth, you may sometimes see that halfway through the match, they'll go out and get the participant to change their shirt because it's so drenched in sweat, or the baseball pitcher will change his shirt because he's so drenched in sweat. But all that's going to do is to make the athlete more comfortable, maybe weigh a little less because he acquired so much weight from his sweat, but it doesn't cool him off. In order for the garment to cool you off, to be effective in evaporative cooling, it must be drenched in water. It must be wet. So you put on a dry shirt, it's going to make you hotter. So the clothing that you wear, you want it to be lightweight, loose-fitting, light in color, and hopefully some of this modern moisture-wicking synthetic kind of clothing that acquires the moisture and it helps it to evaporate. By the way, one of the principal reasons that football players overheat is because of the uniforms they wear. They wear jerseys, and the jerseys retard the heat. They don't wick the heat very well. Right now they have a policy in Texas high school football. So the first week of practice in August, they have to practice with no jersey at all. In fact, they start out with no pads at all. No jersey, no pads. And then they start to put on the pads and so forth. And then they put the jersey on after 2 or 3 weeks because they've gradually acclimatized because the jerseys retain heat. I also put the note down there about bicycle helmets. Many people were certain that when we were required to wear helmets to ride bicycles and motorcycles and so on, that would make their head heat up. But they've developed the bicycles now so that they help your head cool off. So there's no real problem with wearing a helmet as far as heat gain goes. If you can see that picture up there, that's me. I got my own picture and I put on a black wig. So I just wanted you to get all excited about that. Principally, the major physiologic adjustment that we make to heat is in the circulatory system. And the circulatory system is in competition between cooling you off and giving you the energy for exercise. So there's blood diverted from what it's needed to do to transport all of the nutrients, mainly the oxygen, to the exercising muscle. It's now, some of it's being sent to the surface of the skin to help cool you off. So it's in kind of combat between whether or not it's going to help you cool off or help you have the energy to exercise. That's going to reduce your overall capacity to exercise. As that capacity is reduced, you're reaching a higher and higher percent of your absolute oxygen carrying capacity, your VO2 max. So as you have less blood to work with, then you're working with at a higher percent of your maximal capacity. The higher the percent of the maximal capacity that you work, then the greater the increase in body temperature. When your interior temperature gets to a greater than 104, fatigue comes on very, very fast. The athlete or the worker gets tired real fast. But the oxygen cost of the activity does not go down. For example, if you're out running and you're running at a 10-minute mile pace, you'd have to use 35 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body weight per minute to run a 10-minute mile. It doesn't matter how hot it is, how much you weigh, whether you're a man or a woman, whatever. That's the cost of running a 10-minute mile. So if you continue to run at a 10-minute mile while you're overheating, you're working at a higher percent of your max capacity to maintain that oxygen cost. So either you're going to reach fatigue sooner or you're going to have to slow down. Now, also, the output of the heart does not decrease. The heart can only give you so much blood. And as you begin to sweat, the plasma volume falls because most of the sweat comes from plasma. It comes from other cells too, but mostly from plasma. So actually blood volume begins to fall, depending on how hot it is and how strenuous the activity. That means, generally speaking, your exercise performance is going to fall unless you can regulate heat. The key here to regulating heat is acclimatization. And I'm going to say something about acclimatization in a minute. And you may wonder, how come athletes are able to do it? How come workers are able to do it over these long periods and they tend to do very well? Well, that's because they've acclimatized to it. The principal reason people have trouble dealing with the heat while they're exercising in heat is they run out of water. That's called dehydration. Now, way back in the day when I was playing ball, our coaches wouldn't give us water. They thought we were being wimps if we needed water. And the workers out on the pipelines weren't given water. They rationed water to us. They thought we were being little babies if we cried for water. Now we've learned that's crazy. You want to give the athlete and the worker as much water as they need. So loss of water is called dehydration. It simply refers to the fact that you're losing more water through sweat or urine than you're taking in. On average, you lose around 3/4 of a liter. A liter is roughly a quart. Per hour, just under normal conditions, normal temperature conditions, just working out in your yard. That triples, or more than triples, when you exercise in a high heat environment under high intensity. I mean, you can lose 12 liters, 12 quarts in a day. And some people do lose that much and have no problem at all because while they're exercising in the heat, they're constantly drinking water and maybe taking in some other nourishment. No question about it, if you don't rehydrate while you're exercising, then your exercise performance is going to fall and your risk for heat illness goes up drastically as you dehydrate. And this is what dehydration looks like. Many people don't get thirsty until they dehydrate. In fact, one of the definitions of dehydration is that you get thirsty. So if you notice when people come from out and say, boy, I'm thirsty, they've already started the initial stages of dehydration. You want them to drink before they're too thirsty. Their mouth is dry, their tongue is swollen, they get weak and dizzy, they have palpitations, meaning that their heart beats at an irregular fashion. They often tend to be confused and sluggish. The best way to know is to look at your urine. I know that's a real cool thing to talk about, but you want to look at your urine throughout the day. And the condition of dehydration, it tends to be very dark in color, very, very yellow or amber, looks like tea, and it smells bad. I mean, you can tell. So healthy urine doesn't stink as a general rule, and it's lighter in color. So what are the exercise consequences of dehydration? We'll talk about the health consequences. What happens as you dehydrate is the blood volume falls because most of your sweat comes from plasma. So plasma volume falls. If that falls, that means that the blood that you sent to the surface of the skin for cooling, that's going to decrease. And even the sweat rate begins to decrease because you don't have as much fluid for sweat, so you can't cool through evaporation as well. But your body temperature keeps going up. Remember, the hypothalamus is saying to your body, I'm going to have to produce more sweat to cool the guy off. And he can't cool off. And so now I have to produce even more sweat. I've got to send more blood out to the core, the surface of the body to cool off, but that doesn't cool off. And now I don't have as much blood or as much volume to do that. So all I can do is to make the body temperature go higher and higher and higher, which raises the exercise demand. I've given some data here from a real interesting study that was done a long time ago on a group of runners. They put them on treadmills. They measured their aerobic capacity while they were exercising, and they measured changes in body water and changes in body weight while they were exercising. And the average weight was about 160 pounds for the group of people being studied. So if they had a drop of 1.9% body mass due to water loss, that was about 3 pounds. So they lose around 3 pounds in around an hour of exercise. They had a 22% reduction in performance. Now, these guys are wanting to race at the rate of a 5-minute mile for a marathon. If you have a 22 reduction in from 5 minutes, that raises your speed or lowers your time, or increases your time, lowers your speed, to about a 6.5-minute mile. You've lost, now you're out of the ribbons. You're not getting a gold medal or a blue ribbon or anything like that. If you continue to dehydrate, and you really can now, 4.3% loss in body mass means you've lost around almost 7 pounds. And by the way, many years ago, I was in a little study, went way back when I was in grad school. I ran the Houston Marathon, and I lost 7 pounds. I started out around weighed about 158 pounds, and I was down to around 150 when the marathon was over. I lost 7 pounds in that 3.5-hour run I was on. Just me. That's just my own little personal study. 7 pounds, which is about a 4 or 5% reduction in my body mass, which means that's going to be a 48% reduction in performance. That means that 5-minute mile becomes a 7.5-minute mile. You don't have a chance. Now, I didn't run a 5-minute mile, but these athletes could, and that's what happens to the performance. To say nothing about what happens to heat stress. On average, if you look at the table on the left, on average, with no exercise, under just temperate conditions, it's nice conditions, the water source that we take in from fluids and from food and muscle metabolism and so forth is equal to what we lose through urine and sweat and so forth. It's equal. This guy here he takes in around 2.5 liters, or 2,550 milliliters of water from his food and so forth, and he loses about that much on a daily basis. But look at the table on the right. Here's the same guy. He takes in 2,550 milliliters of water through his diet and so forth. But he loses 6,300 mostly through sweat. Notice the skin value is 5,000. That's through the sweat. He loses almost triple what he's taken in. Now, that's about 6.3 liters. Remember, if he keeps it up all day long, that can get to 12 liters, depending on what his level of activity is. If he doesn't continuously rehydrate, you can see what danger he is for heat stress. So what we tell the athletes now is to replace the water and the fluids while they're exercising throughout the activity. Replace it as the plasma volume falls. Replace that plasma volume by drinking adequate fluids. So the adequate hydration is going to help to stave off the heat stress and also help you maintain the same level of performance. There's no doubt about it that workers and athletes have a lower performance in running speeds and work rate and so forth as compared to well-hydrated workers and athletes. And so now the standards now have changed. Used to be we'd deny water and so forth until scheduled breaks. Right after practice you can have a drink and so forth. Now we're telling them to have plenty of fluid before, during, and after the activity. In general, the guidelines are dependent on how long the event lasts. If the event is less than an hour, we're not that concerned. Certainly less than 30 minutes. We're not that concerned about heat stress. We still want them to be well hydrated. So we tell a kid or an athlete or coach to have them drink about a pint. That's a lot of water within 2 to 3 hours before the activity. And even if you're planning a day out digging post holes in your backyard, you need to prepare for it. About a pint. That's a lot of water before you go out there, 2 to 3 hours before. And then right after a warm-up, you got the kids out throwing the football or doing their calisthenics and so forth. And right after the warm-up before the game starts, you have them drinking about a cup of water before the game starts. And then they drink around a half a cup to a cup every 10 to 15 minutes throughout the event. And if the event's an hour or longer, you also ought to add a little sugar or carbohydrate. Not too much, but add some, like Gatorade and those kinds of things. Now, by the way, the concentration of carbohydrate in Gatorade is about twice that. It's more than 8%. It's around 15 or 16%. So you could take a bottle of Gatorade, dump half of it out, and fill the rest of it with water, and that's about the right mixture of carbohydrate there. And adding a little bit of salt is also a good idea. We used to think, oh no, we don't add any more salt. We're afraid it's going to make people have high blood pressure and so on. But adding some helps to prevent heat stress. It also helps to stimulate the drive to drink. It makes the kids want to drink more. Sometimes you can't get an athlete to drink or a worker to drink. You have to force them to drink. Well, you do that in a couple ways. Add some salt and add some sugar. Make it taste good. And right after the event or the workout or working in your yard or whatever, you want to replace a pint to a pint and a half for every pound you've lost. The weight that you lose during exercise is not from fat loss. I'm sorry, folks, if you go out and lose 5 pounds while exercising, you didn't exercise off 5 pounds of fat. It's 5 pounds of water, and your body needs that water. So you need to drink 5 pints, which is hard to do, but you need to do that within that day. The American College of Sports Medicine recommends, on average, to add about 1/3 of a teaspoon, which isn't a lot, about 1/3 of a teaspoon of salt per quart of water. And then a little bit of sugar. So getting some Gatorades, which has salt in it, is a pretty good idea. The idea about the sugar or the sweetener is it makes the kids drink the stuff. Some kids just don't want to drink water, but if you make it sweet, they will. Lots of factors are going to influence your capacity to handle the heat. The best picture up there is that guy up there working in the yard. We got these guys all over Houston. These are the lawn workers all over the place. You see them everywhere. They come out, they start when the sun comes up in the morning, and they quit when the sun goes down. And I've never seen one go down from heat stress. They're drinking water all day long. They know what they're doing because they're acclimatized. They may have other problems, but I'll tell you what, they're tough folks. They work hard in the heat, and it ain't cool in Houston. I'm talking about our conditions. And they work all the time to make a living. And the key is acclimatization. Also, your fitness status. Notice that lady there playing volleyball out in the heat. The more physically fit you are, the better you can tolerate heat. The lower your fitness, the harder it is for you to tolerate heat. Age is not as big a factor as we used to think after the child begins to grow. Now, it is a problem for infants. That's no doubt about it. But we're usually the largest population of heat stress casualty are the elderly. And we think, well, age is a factor because old people are the ones dying of heat stroke. But it's really more closely associated with their level of fitness. If you can keep the elderly fit and hydrated, then their risk of heat injury is about the same as a young person who is, you got to keep that person fit and hydrated. There's really no meaningful difference in the capacity to dissipate heat between men and women. Not really. It's about the same. But there is a big difference in body fat. The fatter you are, the more you're going to insulate heat. The more you're going to have insulation, the more you're going to keep the heat in. And so fitness and fatness are closely associated with the ability to regulate the heat. I like that. You can already see that picture, but that's from the manual that they use for Rangers. I went through Ranger training in the Army, and for paratroopers. And they want to get them acclimatized because they have lots of heat casualties in Ranger training, especially in the summertime. So they want to make sure that if you have casualty, you don't want it to be from heat. And this is what acclimatization does to you in many things. The most important was that first one. It helps to help you increase your plasma volume. And the only way you can do this is to exercise in the heat. Now, some people can get an acclimatization if they exercise in a cool environment. In other words, in an air-conditioned gym, they can get some of those that improving blood flow to the shell and so forth, but they cannot increase plasma volume unless they exercise in the heat. So they have to gradually increase the amount of time they spend working out outside and under hot conditions. It helps to improve all of these conditions. It makes a better distribution of blood from the heart to the muscles. It actually lowers your sweat threshold, so you start to sweat sooner. I mean, you can actually train yourself to be a better sweater. You can sweat more. You have a greater distribution of sweat, not just under the armpits, but from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. You sweat all over the place for evaporative cooling. While you exercise, your body temperature actually isn't as high as a person who's not as acclimatized, and your heart rate is lower. So you can withstand a higher intensity of exercise once you're acclimatized. Also, you don't have as much reliance on anaerobic metabolism. When you reach heat stress, there's a greater reliance on metabolizing anaerobically using your stored sugars rather than using the acquired oxygen, because the acquired oxygen is in the blood and the blood is being used for other things. But as you acclimatize, you don't need that sugar in the glycogen in the muscle and liver and so forth. You can use the aerobic energy more efficiently. All of this helps you to adapt to the heat and to the exercise. So what happens if you overheat? There's 3 forms of heat casualty: cramps, exhaustion, and stroke. They usually come in that order, though not always. Usually you get a cramp first. And of all the sports I've seen, the ones that I see the sport that has most commonly has a heat cramps is tennis. And that's the other sports get it, but that's pretty much verified on sports records. Tennis players really get it. Remember, a tennis match can last for hours. It's usually out on a hot surface on a hot day, and men, do they ever have a problem? It's a very, very painful. If you've never had a heat cramp, well, you're lucky. If you've ever have a Charlie horse in the middle of the night that sends you up to the top of the ceiling, that feels pretty much the same way. It's just a constant muscle contraction that just won't go away. It's extremely painful, and it will stop your activity. So it's due mainly to dehydration and a loss of electrolytes. And it always comes with activity, not just sitting in the heat. It always comes from muscle activity. And so that means you've got to stop the activity. And when I was in sports years ago, a guy'd get a cramp and say, shut up, suck it up, don't be a wimp, and keep working. And we told the guys that in the Army, before I learned better. Shut up, keep going. Well, we learned better. We're going to have to stop the activity. Probably the best thing to do is to stretch the muscle. That makes the pain go away right away. Then you're going to have to rest, rehydrate. They can get the athletes back in the game if they rehydrate them pretty fast and cool them off. If the symptoms don't go away in 30 minutes to an hour, you may need to go to a doctor because you may have a more serious condition. Heat exhaustion tends to be the next step, though not always. It doesn't always follow heat cramps, but it usually does. And heat exhaustion, that title pretty much defines the problem. That is, you are really exhausted. You are really fatigued. You can't exercise anymore. You've got to stop working. So a boss or a coach can't tell the person to keep going because they can't. And the next phase can be fatal. It only comes with exercise. It doesn't come from sitting in a sauna or sitting in the heat. It comes from exercise, muscle activity. The symptoms are different from stroke, though. A heat exhaustion victim has very pale and clammy skin, feels kind of slimy to the feet when you touch it. It's not really that hot yet. It's clammy. But the rest of the symptoms are very similar to stroke: confusion, headache, dizziness, dark-colored urine, extreme fatigue, rapid and weak heartbeat. But it can be a safety valve. If they got a heat exhaustion and they can't exercise anymore and they stop the exercise and you cool them off. If you got a football player, lay him on his back, cool him off and elevate his legs. Raise his legs up in the air. That almost always restores energy to the person. I'm not saying put him back in the game, but I'm saying that will help to reduce the symptoms of the heat exhaustion. And because if you don't, the next step can be a fatal step, which is heat stroke. Now, heat stroke needs to be... you need to see the difference between exhaustion and stroke. Now, there are some symptoms that are similar. They're totally exhausted, they're worn out. But the big difference is in body temperature. The body temperature of a heat stroke patient goes straight through the brain pan. I mean, it's 105 degrees Fahrenheit or more. It's very, very hot. So if you touch this person on the face, it burns your fingers. It's really, really hot. But there's kind of two forms. There's heat stroke and there's exertional heat stroke. Heat stroke can occur by just sitting in a sauna or just sitting outside, or for an elderly person sitting in his home in Dallas, Texas, where the air conditioner got turned off and just sitting there. No activity, heat stroke can occur. The problem in a very humid area where you got the athletes and workers working hard is they're still sweating profusely. It looks like they're still sweating profusely. Actually, sweating has stopped. They're no longer sweating, but the sweat hasn't evaporated. So they're just covered wet. They look very, very wet. They're soaked, but there's no longer sweating. That mechanism has stopped. They can no longer help to cool themselves anyway. And they can lose consciousness and lose their lives very fast. As a matter of fact, we lost 206 people to heat stroke last year alone, in year 2010, to 2011, 138 in 2010. Over 20 have died already this summer in Chicago. And I think the number's probably gone up. I'm just losing track. The most fatal states, by the way, tend to be the states with the biggest cities. Texas is the leading state, followed by Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, where they have people in these cities and they're sitting in their homes with heat waves. But the death from heat stroke is about twice as great in the last couple of years as compared to the previous 10-year average. Body temperature goes up, and the central nervous system has problem regulating its organs. So you have confusion, dizziness, and so forth. You lose the capacity to continue to sweat, and it can be a fatal condition. They often complain of many things. It's not always the same thing, but a throbbing headache is a very common complaint. Dizziness, lightheadedness, cramps. They tend to throw up, rapid heartbeat. They don't have to. If their temperature goes real high, that doesn't always happen, but they almost always collapse. And sometimes they get belligerent and want to fight you. You have to force them to stop exercising. The best thing to do is to throw them in a tub of ice, like it shows in that picture. I mean, lower the body temperature as fast as you can. If you don't have ice, put ice bags around their neck, groin, underarms to lower the temperature as soon as you can and make them stop exercising. And it is an emergency. Call the ambulance and get them evacuated. But they say now, cool first and then transport. So throw them in the ice and get the ambulance to come. Now, if you're going to be living in areas where it's hot, which tends to be the United States, it seems like the whole country is covered with the heat wave, it doesn't mean you can't go outside and exercise. Otherwise, you never go out there, and you never acclimatize. So I tell people down here, you don't have an excuse not to exercise just because it's hot. I have many people saying, I'm not going to go out there at all, ever, because it's too hot. And we've had problems in North America and other places with the vitamin D deficiency because people don't get enough sun. So you've got to get out there. But to get out there, you must acclimatize. And the only way you acclimatize to the heat is to exercise in the heat. Just don't do it all at once. Just make it a little 10-minute, then 20 minutes, then 15, then 30, a little more and more time out there. Increase the intake of your water. We find most dehydration occurs at the end of the summer. Many of the heat casualties at the beginning of the summer because they haven't acclimatized yet. At the end of the summer because they're sweating so much, but they haven't replaced the sweat that they've lost, and gradually they've acquired dehydration gradually throughout the summer. So you got to drink more and more water. And also you're going to have to slow down. If you're accustomed to a 10-minute mile in the wintertime, it's going to be an 11-minute mile in the summer. Like it or not, it's going to happen to you. So you're going to have to slow down and reduce the amount of time outdoors. Also, take advantage of the coolest hours of the day. Early morning, late evening. Around here, the hottest time of the day is 4 p.m. to 4:30. That's when our fitness programs start, by the way. Around here, the hottest time of the day. Take advantage of the shade. Run under the trees, not out on the street. Make sure that you get as naked as modesty will allow. Don't wear rubber clothes and sweatpants. And I'm telling you, I'm working at NASA, where we're supposed to have the smartest people in the world. And I still see idiots on our running trail in sweatpants and sweatshirts. I'm not kidding. And I go and I say, why are you wearing that sweat garment? And the guy says, well, I'm trying to lose weight. Yeah, you are. You're going to lose water weight. You're going to kill yourself. But that's not fat weight. And I try to be polite, but I'm not always that polite. Make sure you go out and exercise in the heat with a partner, so that at least the partner knows the symptoms of heat stress, and the partner can get you, take care of you. And if you feel the symptoms, stop exercising. And don't be embarrassed about it. I'm the fitness guy here at NASA, and I used to get heat cramps out on my runs, and everybody can see out on the road. And I didn't want to stop because people would think I was a wimp, limping in. I didn't want them to know that I'd had a problem and that I'm a wimp. But if I didn't do it, I'm going to have a problem that lasts for a long time. So you're going to have to stop the exercise and cool off if you want to survive. Now, we have other environmental factors. They're pretty rare in South Texas, but you have in other places. But you can still exercise even when it's cold or when it rains and so forth. But you just have to be aware of these conditions. I tell people that it's not cold unless it's below freezing. In Houston, people go into panic when it's 60 degrees. And I'm not kidding. The folks come to my exercise program, we're going outside, it's 60 degrees. Now, it's not cold unless it's really cold. And then when it is, you want to make sure you wear gloves and a hat or something like that, because there's no way your fingers are going to be warm enough, no way the top of your head's going to warm up, especially if you have a hairdo like mine. So, you need to keep your top of your head warm. Other than that, you're usually pretty well off. Also, I tell people about the rain. The best time for me to go outside to run is when it starts to rain, because that's when it's cool. And the rainwater does not go through the skin. It doesn't hurt you. It keeps you cool. But you got to be concerned about the lightning, because that can kill you. So we have lightning alerts here, and so if we have lightning, you can't go outside. The real casualties for people exercising is that they get run over by a car, especially if they're riding a bike. they're not paying attention, and the cars aren't paying attention. Well, the winner is always going to be the car. He's always going to, you don't have a chance, so you have to watch out for that. As far as exercising and air pollution, we're talking about serious air pollution. You don't want to run around behind a diesel truck. But most of the time, when you run along the roads, most of the time that carbon monoxide goes straight up into the atmosphere. It's not going to hurt you. But if you have a serious polluted condition, and occasionally we will have, you probably shouldn't exercise in air pollution, because that's going to not only have an effect on your respiratory system, it also has a damaging effect on your brain. So there are all kinds of problems exercising in pollution. And we don't have trouble with altitude around here. We're practically sea level or below, but there's no doubt about it that due to barometric pressure, it's more difficult to exercise at high altitude, and that's a condition you have to acclimatize for too. I think I've managed to get my presentation in about the right amount of time here, Janine. I'm always worried about running out of time. But here's my summary. We gain heat mostly from environmental temperature and muscle metabolism and the clothes that we wear. We lose heat by irradiating the heat from the surface of our skin as long as the outdoor temperature is 92 degrees or less, and evaporative cooling. Those are the principal ways. Our capacity to exercise is really affected by the ability to circulate the blood and for sweat to evaporate, and that's greatly determined by the amount of hydration, the hydration status that we maintain. Acclimatizing is the key to exercising in the heat. If you gradually acclimatize for the heat, you can do it in the heat. So if you exercise in the heat too much, the injuries are cramps, exhaustion, and stroke. Stroke can be fatal. And by the way, heat stroke is commonly fatal, or is fatal around almost 30%. Close to that, around 30% die from it. And many of the deaths don't happen the day of the event. They happen months later because of damage done to the organs, the kidney, the liver, the heart, and the brain in particular. And then some other environmental factors we don't worry about too much around here are the cold, the rain, lightning, and pollution and altitude. That concludes my presentation. Do Janine, you, or anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Larry?
Yes.
Can you hear me? This
Yes.
is Daryl Matula. I'm the JSAT Wellness lead. And I wanted to ask if you have any opinion on salt pills.
Yes, I do. Salt pills the problem with the salt pill is they're so concentrated is they're difficult to digest them. So it's difficult for the body to dilute them enough to get them out to your system. So usually we say it's not, that's way too much salt. Adding some salt, and like I said, a third of a teaspoon per quart isn't very much. There's a whole lot more than that in a pill. We used to give pills out in the Army and so forth, and they don't do that anymore.
Okay, is one salt pill harmful, or would it be, if you chew it up, would that be okay?
I don't know whether or not it's harmful. That's really not my expertise. Usually, I understand when you swallow these things, after a while, it just really causes you to have way too much acquired sodium. But you'd probably be better off asking my dietitian that question, because that's not really my area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two questions
Yeah.
from headquarters. You mentioned the increased plasma volume. Does that have any effect on blood pressure? And also, why does it seem like after a run in the heat, you start sweating more when you stop running?
As you exercise, your blood pressure will increase. However, especially in the heat, but as you begin to exercise and acclimatize to it, the blood pressure actually begins to fall. So you adjust to that. And the plasma volume, the drop in the plasma volume, you'd think, well, gee, if I have less blood, my pressure is going to have to go down. But because of the constriction, and remember that the vessels are constricted down near the muscles, that doesn't tend to cause the blood pressure to fall. It either stays the same or rises some. And as you begin to acclimatize, that helps you to regulate your blood pressure. As far as why do you sweat more when you stop, I seem to too. I'm not really sure I do. Maybe it just seems like it. I'm not really sure why, but I think just your body's trying to cool off faster. But why? I don't know. I wish I knew.
I have a question. This is Nancy from Goddard. Your symptoms for heat stroke seem to be so close to a heart attack symptom for a woman. How would you ascertain the difference?
I don't know. I mean, I can say this: heat stroke is often misdiagnosed. It has been misdiagnosed for many reasons. One is down in this part of the country, especially exertional heat stroke that always comes with people who have been very physically active. We used to think that the heat stroke had to have dry skin. It's very hot and dry skin. And the doctors would say, this isn't dry, it's very, very wet, so it's not heat stroke, but that's just because it hasn't evaporated, and those conditions are different. And as far as, I don't believe that the body temperature goes that high. I've never heard of it going that high under conditions of heart attack. I mean, and the definition of heat stroke is a very, very high body temperature. I mean, 105 plus. And I've never seen that as a symptom of a heart attack.
Okay, so the deal would be to check out the temperature.
Yeah, I mean, if a person having heat stroke, you put your hand on their face, it feels like it burns your fingers. I mean, it's really, really hot.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Now, I've got to say real quickly, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm an exercise scientist. I wish I had some medical doctors here because I was afraid some of this presentation would stimulate some medical questions that I can't answer. But I just can't answer those specific medical questions.
If there are those questions, can we forward them and perhaps one of the physicians can respond back?
Sure.
Larry, Dr. Weir, this is Kathy Ann Gotti.
Yeah.
I want to congratulate you on a very good and a very graphic, very blunt presentation. And what you said about people, if they had questions, checking with their physician, they could always ask their clinic physician as well, and then get back to you. They can coordinate and work with you on that. But excellent presentation.
Thank you, Kathy.
Hey, Larry, this is Janine. Actually, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
I've noticed here in Florida that a lot of outside workers will wear a cap and long sleeves and long pants, and I look at them in amazement, thinking, oh my gosh, how can they work in that hot clothing all day? And they're out there all day in that clothing. The folks that work out in the yards and the road workers. Is there a climatization that occurs with that too, and they because they're drinking lots of water, they just figured out I can work like this as long as I drink a lot of water? Is that a normal thing? Is that typical?
That is typical. We see that here. My wife and I, in fact, were just commenting about that. A guy was building a roof on a patio we had built this summer, and I mean it was really hot. He had a long sleeve shirt. He had on a hat. He was drinking water constantly. And the long sleeve shirt was made out of cotton or linen, which is something that really does handle the heat very well. It helps to, to enable heat dissipation. And he dresses like that to protect his skin and protect his head against radiant energy from the sun. So that's a recommended apparel for outdoors. Now, if you're an athlete or running or something like that, I still wear cotton T-shirts because I'm too cheap to buy something very expensive. But after a while, they begin to chafe and they can get heavy and so on. Nowadays, they got this synthetic material that's really recommended. It really does a good job. And I've worn it a few times, and it does a good job to dissipate the heat. Much better than the old-fashioned cotton shirts. So what these yard workers are doing, if they've gotten so acclimatized, and because they're working in the heat all the time, we ought to learn something from them. Watch what they do and how they do it, because I've never known of one to have a heat problem. They got other problems, but I've never known them to go down from heat. So they must know something.
And what about the those cooling scarves that I've seen where people will either freeze them or they've got some kind of a chemical something or other to are those worthwhile, or is that just a gimmick?
Well,
is that just psychological?
They're worthwhile, but it's very temporary. I mean, because it does help. Boy, it makes you feel good. When it's really, really hot and you're really, really hot, you need something more than that.
Right.
there are some running events where they'll have you these misters. You can run through a mist and it helps to cool you off. But when it's real hot, that just doesn't last long enough. You got to have a mister the whole 25 miles, or depending on the distance of the race. So, ice is the way to go if you want to put it around your neck. An ice bag.
All right. Thanks very much. Anybody else have any questions for Larry?
Larry, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
When you drink fluids, water or Gatorade, is it beneficial to have it really cold or like ice in it, or does it cool down inside? I mean,
the question is, when you're drinking fluids, does the temperature of the fluid matter? Is it better to have a cold drink than not a cold drink? Definitely a cold drink. For one thing, they've done research on this. For one thing, people won't drink anything but cold. I mean, when you're out hot, you don't want to drink something unless it's cold. So that helps to stimulate your drive to drink. It helps to motivate drinking. And I know it warms off pretty fast, but it does help cool you off faster if you drink a cold drink than if you drink a hot drink or not a cold drink. So the temperature of the drink does matter.
Yeah, I think of like when I run, even when you hold the bottle, after a while it gets warm because of the heat, or the sun as well as your heat from your hand, kind of. So sometimes what people do is they put a little bit of liquid and kind of freeze the bottle, and then by the time you run, it kind of becomes it helps too. So that's something you can use if you need to be cold.
Yeah. Put lots of ice in your bottle.
Question from headquarters. Can you compare drinking sports drinks with plain water?
Yes, there's been a lot of research on that. As a general rule, now remember what we look at is if the event is about an hour, is it a lengthy event? Now you got some kids playing a soccer tournament, or you're playing in a tennis match, and they can go on for hours and hours. So something for a long time in the heat. Sports drinks are definitely of value. And I'm not going to tell you whether Gatorade's better than Powerade, because I don't really know for sure. I don't think anybody is for sure. But there is value in the electrolytes that's in there, especially the sodium, and in the glucose, the sugar that's in there. As long as you don't have too much sugar in there. By the way, it's kind of interesting. They found there's a whole lot more cooling value drinking a drink that has 5%, in other words, a little bit of sugar in it, as compared to a bottle of Gatorade that's got 15%, roughly, in a bottle. For a hot day, as compared to working out in a cold day, playing a football game or a tennis match on a cold day, it tends to cool you off if you don't have too much sugar in there, because there's some redirection of the energy and so on. So you don't have too much sugar in your drink. That help you with your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, some sugar, not too much.
Anybody else? Larry, it sounds like a wrap.
Yes, ma'am. We'll get together about what to do with.
Again.
Yeah. We'll get together and decide what to do with all these bits that we've collected.
Absolutely. They're a really great resource. So everyone who is on this, listening to this presentation, ohp.nasa.gov is where all the presentations are located. If you want to take a look at the slides, print them out for reference. And I can't speak for you, Larry, but I'll bet you'd be glad to field any questions that anybody has if they go back and look at some previous presentations and they want to talk to you about them.
Sure.
So that's Larry Ware at Johnson Space Center, and I'm sure Larry would be more than happy to talk to you about any questions that you have. And thank you very much for attending, and thanks again, JSC and Larry and Glenda, for doing such great presentations over the past, I don't know, how long has it been, Larry? Has it been like 6 months? I can't remember.
I think we started our first one in May, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it's been great. I really enjoyed them.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everybody.